Iconic photojournalist Dr Peter Magubane has been lauded for playing a pivotal role in the fight against apartheid with his photographs exposing atrocities globally. The award-winning photographer has been honoured at a memorial service in Soweto. Dr Magubane died on the 1st of January, aged 91, after a long illness. Artist and author of Yakhal'inkomo, portrait of a jazz classic, Percy Mabandu, has had the pleasure of interviewing Dr Magubane and joins us live now. Thank you so much for your time this evening. Let's just start with the first time you met him. What was that like?
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a really tough time. I first met Dr. Peter Magubane as a journalist with the City Press. And at the time, he had just been diagnosed with prostate cancer. And we were all sort of scurrying about with the worry that he might not be with us long enough. So naturally, as a journalist who had admired him from a distance, and others who treasured his work, we gravitated towards him to sort of, put our hands around him. And we got a sense that not enough had been done to sort of tell his story. And that meant spending time with him at his home in Melville, and going through his archive. And that was a rare opportunity to enjoy him or to get to spend with him in a kind of twofold, not only engaging him with professional kind of gathering insights and sort of interviewing, but also getting to understand him as a human being. What I took away, to heart at the time was his ability to transcend the professional, to remind you that in the end we're just two human beings, and we are an elder and a junior. So he took on this kind of Mandela father figure-ish aura, like a grandfather who was sort of holding you and giving you stories about the home, and it became that kind of relationship where the professional need to gather the story sort of fell away, and it became, a little boy or a young man and an older man, much more experienced, exploring the interface between work and life.
Yeah.
And I think that texture where life meets work is where he had honed what gave meaning to what we think of as his legacy. Peter Magubane managed in a very unique way to humanize the act of photojournalism, which is often discussed with the need for professional distance, to not get too involved, to manage to, protect your emotions from what is often terrible human and tragic human stories. But he had managed to tinge his work with the necessary kind of humanity, even as he was a witness to it through the lens. And I think that will be, the meaning of his legacy. Our Bill of Rights begin, with the first clause of the right to dignity. And I think he's part of the generation that understood what it means to fight for that Bill of Rights to be governed or to be anchored by the right to dignity. And he really gave dignity to his subjects.
And Percy, you touch on something very important that I was also going to talk about, particularly when you think about his archive. He had this incredible ability to capture the human symbols of oppression, but he did them in such a way that was so tender, and it also drew, your interest to find out more about the stories that he would be telling.
Yeah, look, one of the photographs that I was moved so much by to be able to write about for the City Press then was a photograph of a nanny, a black nanny or an African, woman who was looking after this white child. And they were in the park, and they were at the moment where the child needed to take rest and sit. But the bench in the park said Europeans only. So here's this black woman who's looking after this child, but cannot sit with her on the same bench because the bench is reserved by the apartheid state to people of European descent. And in the photograph, you see this woman crouching behind that bench while this child is sitting on the other side of, the sittable side of the bench, and she's still tendering to her. There's a tender moment that Peter Magubane captures where this, the gaze or the eyes of this caregiver lands behind, this child, and she's brushing her hair. And there's a tenderness that you speak about. There's a motherly touch that this woman is bringing to this moment. And when you bring into context the fact that often these women have left their own children in their homes far away, and they only go to their children, once a month at month end, if at all. And here she is giving motherly love to this child with whom she cannot share a seat. And this tender moment of motherly love, however surrogate, Peter Magubane managed to capture with just one photograph, and that told of the unspoken terrors, the unspoken human indignities that the government at the time was visiting on African people.
And finally, then, very briefly, Percy, let's talk about the lesson that for you stood out and you really, just took, especially when you met him and life met work, and you were this young professional speaking to somebody who was so experienced, and that afternoon it became about exchanging more than, some facts for your interview. So what for you stood out that afternoon?
That what we do is not a collection of facts. What we do is to become witness to the real lived experience of human beings. And so the humanity of the people you interact with must be at the center of what you do as a storyteller. You are witness to their humanity, often violated, or even when it's being lionized and celebrated, which is often the case when you work in the art journalism space. You're often talking to artists who are being celebrated and so on. But in those moments when you're dealing with people who might not be thought of as people worthy of celebration, you must remember that you are not there to gather facts which are going to be enumerated and delineated on the page, but you're here to be witness to somebody's humanity who's often ignored by the machine that is everyday life. And I want to return to this idea that our Bill of Rights begins with the right to dignity. And I think someone like Peter Magubane, who's part of the generation, that began, in the 1950s, this journey that got us to the Constitution that we enjoy today, understood very well what that means. He had been thrown into solitary confinement a number of times. He had taken a photograph of protesters outside the prison where Winnie Mandela and 21 other women who had been protesting were arrested. And he was banned from taking photographs for 5 years. He defied that banning order because he understood that he needed to do the work. His work was necessary. He tells a story of how at some point he had considered going into exile and giving up. But when he was on the border with Swaziland, sleeping for the last time on the country of his birth in a guest house, he had an epiphany and a dream that, no, go back home and do your work, pick up the camera. And we are so lucky that he did that, because what unfolded was a lifelong commitment to being witness to our humanity.
And as you say, what we do is not a collection of facts. It definitely isn't. And thank you so much for sharing these lessons and these insights with us, Percy. We do appreciate it. That is artist and author of Yakhal'inkomo, Portrait of a Jazz Classic, Percy Mabandu.